The rain had been falling for 6 hours when Dara Vasquez finally threw the umbrella away. She didn't hurl it. She didn't curse it. She just opened her fingers and let it drop into the mud beside the road, the way you let go of something you've already mourned. The canopy had inverted in the wind sometime around hour 3 and never recovered, a skeleton of bent aluminum spokes and shredded black nylon, good for nothing now. She'd been carrying it out of stubbornness more than anything, some small refusal to admit that the day had completely beaten her. It hit the mud and sank a little, and she walked on. She was 3 kilometers from the emergency relay station on the Kessler Ridge line. Or so the terrain map on her cracked wrist unit insisted. The flooding had taken out the road bridge at the bottom of the valley, so she'd gone up and over, through logging terrain that had become a brown soup of runoff and loose shale. Her boot seals had failed around kilometer 4. Her jacket's thermal layer had failed at kilometer 7. Her morale had failed somewhere before that, though she couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Dara was a maintenance engineer for Meridian Relay Systems, which was a grand title for someone who fixed broken signal repeaters at the far edges of the Northern Territories, mostly alone, mostly in bad weather. She was 31 years old, compact and capable, with the kind of face that looked tired by default and alert when it mattered. She had done this job for 9 years. She knew how to manage cold, how to manage alone, how to manage the particular flatness that set in after too many hours in the rain. What she didn't know how to manage was what she found when she came over the last rise and looked down at the relay station. There was something crouched against the wall of the equipment shed. Her first thought was bear. Her second thought was that it was too big for a bear and shaped wrong, too many limbs, arranged in an arrangement that her brain kept trying to correct and couldn't. She stopped moving and stood in the rain with her hand near the small emergency flare gun on her hip, which would not have done much against a bear, and would do even less against whatever this was. It wasn't moving. Or it was moving, but only slightly, a kind of trembling that she recognized after a moment as the involuntary shaking of something very cold or very frightened. She stood there for a long time. The rain hammered down. The thing against the wall didn't look at her, or if it did, she couldn't tell. Then she heard the sound. It came from inside the shape, from within the folded mass of whatever the large thing was, and it was the smallest sound she'd heard in a long time. A thin, high, rhythmic noise, barely above the register of the rain. Not a mechanical sound, not a distress signal. It was the sound of something small trying very hard to breathe. Dara's hand came away from the flare gun. She moved down the slope. The thing against the wall heard her coming, or sensed her maybe, in whatever way it sensed things, and the trembling intensified. The mass of it shifted, and she got her first real look at it in the flat gray light of the overcast afternoon, and she stopped again, not from fear this time, but from the simple need to process what she was seeing. It was an alien, which was not, in the 31st year of post-contact Earth, a remarkable thing to say. There were 7 species with whom humanity had established formal relations, another 4 with whom relations remained in early negotiation, and an unknown number with whom humanity had only made accidental contact. The remarkable thing was not that it was alien. The remarkable thing was the size of it. It was enormous. Easily 3 meters at the shoulder when standing. She judged from the length of the limbs it had folded around itself. Its skin, or carapace, she wasn't sure, was the color of wet slate, plated and ridged in a way that reminded her of armadillo hide. If armadillos grew to the size of draft horses and had 6 limbs, the forward 2 of which had resolved over evolutionary time into something that resembled hands only in the most abstract sense. Wide, flat-palmed, multi-jointed, with long fingers that ended in blunt curves rather than claws. Its head was lowered and she could not see its face. Its shoulders, if those were its shoulders, were heaving in a pattern she recognized as distress breathing even before she understood why. It was holding something. It was holding something against what she guessed was its chest, cradled in those wide, flat hands, and the something was the source of the small, thin sound, smaller than a human newborn, the same slate-gray coloring but softer looking, less plated, more of the raw vulnerability of a new thing that hasn't yet hardened into itself. It was making the sound between shallow, struggling breaths. It was making the sound of a being in the process of running out. The large alien, the mother, Dara understood without being told, lifted her head then. The face was broad and flat, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal bar, currently the color of dim amber. No visible nose in any configuration she recognized. A wide, thin-lipped mouth set in a grim line. The amber eyes tracked to Dara and held there, and what Dara read in them, across every gap of biology and language and evolutionary history, was an expression she had worn herself. In the hospital waiting room at 3 a.m. at the side of her sister's bed 3 years ago, watching machines measure the distance between alive and not. The face of someone who has run out of options and knows it and is still here anyway, still holding on, because there is nowhere else to be. Dara looked at the creature holding its dying child in the rain beside her equipment shed and thought, okay. She did not know this species. She did not speak its language. She did not know what it ate, what it breathed at what ratio, what temperature it required, what had brought it here, or what had injured the small one, or how long they had been here before she arrived. She did not know any of the things she would have needed to know to help in any systematic way. She went to help anyway. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, which she knew was meaningless but said anyway, because in her experience the tone carried even when the words didn't. She kept her hands visible. She moved slowly. She stopped 2 meters away and crouched down to lower her apparent threat profile. She'd done a 2-day alien encounter awareness course 4 years ago that had included this tip, along with the reminder that most of it was useless in actual practice, which turned out to be accurate. The mother's amber eyes tracked her. The breathing didn't change. The small one's sound was getting thinner. "I have a kit inside," Dara said. "Emergency medical, probably not calibrated for you, but there might be something." She stood carefully and went to the shed door. The Kessler Ridge relay station was not much to look at. A poured concrete equipment bunker with a steel door, a diesel generator in a weatherproof housing, 3 signal repeater towers on the ridge above, and inside, a workbench, tool storage, a basic emergency kit that all Meridian stations were required to maintain by regulation, a cot for when the weather stranded engineers overnight, a small stove, and a wall of storage lockers that mostly held spare relay components. She left the shed door open and started going through the emergency kit by headlamp. Thermal wrap, which was designed for human hypothermia but might buy time. Antiseptic, which she set aside because she had no idea of the biochemistry. 2 different sizes of pressure bandage. A basic airway kit. And then the contents of the main first aid box. An auto-injector set calibrated to human physiology. A field diagnostic wand that would tell her nothing about alien biology. A packet of glucose tablets. A mylar heat sheet. She brought the heat sheet first. She went back out into the rain and held it up to show the mother, then moved slowly toward the small one. The mother watched her with those amber eyes and did not move away, which Dara took as the most profound kind of trust she'd ever been offered. The small one's breathing up close was a horror. Each breath was a visible labor. The chest, if that was its chest, worked too hard for too little air. She'd seen this before in a different context. Her sister's lungs, the same quality of terrible effort. She draped the heat sheet over the small one as gently as she could. The mylar crinkled and the small one flinched at the sound, and then stilled again. She went back inside. She stood at the workbench for a long time with her hands flat on the surface and thought. The emergency kit had nothing for this. What she needed was something she didn't have, a knowledge base she'd never built, a medical understanding of a species she'd never encountered. What she had was tools, wire, spare relay components, a broken umbrella in the mud 3 kilometers back up the trail, a head full of mechanical solutions to signal problems, and the willingness to do something stupid and possibly useless. She started going through the lockers. Here is what she knew about the small one's breathing. It was obstructed. Something was blocking the airway, or the airway was collapsing, or there was fluid, or there was damage. She didn't know which, but she knew what obstructed breathing looked like, and she knew that if nothing was done, it ended the same way every time. She found a set of relay coupling tubes in the third locker, small diameter aluminum tubes, 5 millimeters, used for running signal wire through tight conduit passages. She found a roll of medical-grade surgical tape left over from when Haynes, her predecessor at this station, had wrapped a sprained wrist 2 winters ago. She found a small battery-powered pump meant for clearing condensation from signal housings. She looked at these things for a long time. She thought about the umbrella in the mud. She went back outside. The mother watched her. The small one's breathing had thinned further, more space between the sounds now, and that was the wrong direction. Dara knelt in the mud. She was soaking wet and had been for hours, and the cold had moved past the point where she was actively registering it. She looked at the small one's face. The airway, she found what she thought was the airway, a narrow opening at the front of the creature's throat, structured differently than anything she'd worked with, but physically, functionally, an airway, a tube meant to pass air. It was partially blocked by what looked like swelling or collapsed tissue. She couldn't be certain. She was not a doctor. She was a woman who fixed radios in the rain. She went back inside and got the coupling tube and the pump. She looked at the coupling tube, 5 millimeters, too large. She found a file and sat down at the workbench and spent 11 minutes filing the edges smooth, then spent another 4 minutes testing the airflow. She spent 3 more finding the thinnest gauge wire in the locker, the kind used for precision antenna alignment, almost hair thin, and formed a small retaining loop so the tube wouldn't migrate once placed. Then she sat very still and thought about whether she was about to make things better or worse. She thought about this with full honesty, because she had been in enough equipment crises to know that the most dangerous engineer was the one who acted to feel useful rather than to be useful. She ran through what she knew: obstructed airway, no chemical intervention available, no imaging, no diagnosis beyond visual. What she had was a tube of approximately the right diameter, smooth edges, a wire anchor to keep it in place, and the understanding that the alternative was to sit here and watch the small one stop making sounds altogether. She made a decision. She went outside and knelt in the mud again and looked at the mother's amber eyes and said, "I'm going to try something. I don't know if it'll work. I need you to hold still." The mother looked at her for a long moment. The rain fell. Then the wide flat hands shifted fractionally, offering the small one forward, just slightly, the smallest possible gesture of permission, or of desperation, or of both. Dara worked. Her hands were cold and not as steady as she would have liked. She worked slowly, deliberately, talking quietly the whole time, not words of any meaning but just a sound, a low continuous murmur, because in her experience even beings who couldn't understand language responded to the quality of a voice, and she wanted hers to say calm, careful here. The airway placement took 4 attempts. On the 3rd attempt, the small one's head moved in a way that might have been a reaction, and she stopped and waited, and then continued. On the 4th attempt, she felt the tube seat correctly. The resistance changed to something that felt like open passage, and she taped the wire anchor in place with hands that were shaking slightly now. She sat back on her heels. The small one breathed in. It was not a dramatic breath. It was a small, tentative, questioning breath, the kind a being takes when it has forgotten what a full breath feels like and is cautiously exploring the possibility. And then another, and another. The terrible working labor of the chest softened by degrees, the intervals between sounds lengthening not from fading but from actual recovery, actual air reaching the places that needed it. Dara exhaled. Her breath misted in the cold air. The mother made a sound. It was not a sound Dara had heard before. It was low and resonant and came from somewhere deep in the chest, a sustained note that changed frequency partway through in a way that felt deliberate, structured, like the opening phrase of something. It lasted about 4 seconds and then stopped. The amber eyes, when Dara looked up, were no longer dim. They were brighter, not human bright, but changed. Dara said, "Yeah, I know." She went inside and made tea on the small stove, the only warm thing she had, and she stood in the shed doorway and drank it and looked at the alien mother sheltering her small one against the wall of the concrete building, and the rain hammered down on the ridge above them, and the signal repeaters turned in the wind, and somewhere up the trail, a broken umbrella was sinking slowly into the mud, and she thought, today was a strange day. The mother did not leave. Dara hadn't expected her to, not that night, not with the small one still fragile and the weather still closing. She set up the small camp stove near the shed door and ran an extension from the generator to power a work light, creating the warmest, brightest area she could manage without knowing whether the aliens wanted warmth and light or were harmed by it. She moved slowly and explained what she was doing in a running, quiet commentary that she knew was meaningless as language and meaningful as signal. She's used to working alone. She talked to equipment when things were going wrong. It helped her think. Tonight it seemed to do something more than that. By midnight the small one was sleeping. The sleep looked real, a heaviness, a letting go, the chest moving in a slow, easy rhythm that the labor was gone from. Dara sat on an overturned equipment case just inside the doorway and watched the rain and thought about her report. She would have to file a report. An unregistered contact event, a species she couldn't identify, at a remote relay station during a weather event. The paperwork alone would be substantial. There would be protocols. There would be people who wanted to send teams. She looked at the mother's face, the amber eyes half closed now, watchful but no longer urgent. She thought about what teams showing up would mean. Scientists, diplomats, people with clipboards and the best of intentions and the absolute certainty that they knew how to handle this. She thought about the small thing sleeping wrapped in mylar, breathing through a 5mm relay tube held in place with antenna wire and surgical tape. She slept in the shed that night on the cot, with the door open 3 inches because she did not want to close it all the way. She woke twice, once when the generator cycled, and once for no reason she could identify, and both times she lay still and listened and heard the mother's breathing and the small one's breathing, different rhythms, layered, and went back to sleep. In the morning, the rain had lightened. She made coffee on the camp stove and stood in the doorway with both hands around the mug, and watched the light come in low and flat over the ridge. The mother was awake, or she thought she was. The amber eyes were fully open and tracking. The small one was still sleeping. The relay tube was still in place, the wire loop still seated, and the small chest was moving in a rhythm that no longer looked like work. She thought about food. She had 3 days of emergency rations in the station locker, the compressed calorie bars that tasted like cardboard and necessity. She had no idea whether Vareth ate anything even remotely comparable to what she had, but she went inside and looked through the locker anyway, and then she looked at the coffee and the bars, and she ate half a bar slowly and thought about the biochemistry. The problem was not generosity. The problem was that giving the wrong thing could be worse than giving nothing, and she didn't know enough to know which side of that line anything fell on. She had learned this lesson the hard way once, years ago, when she'd fed a cat she'd found at a relay station outside Reykjavik, and the cat had turned out to be diabetic, and the outcome had been bad and she still felt bad about it. The cat had been fine in the end, but there had been a veterinary visit and a bill, and a feeling of having caused harm while intending good that had stayed with her. She was not going to accidentally poison an alien infant with calorie bars. She drank her coffee and watched the light. Around mid-morning, the small one woke up. Dara knew it from the change in the mother's posture, a subtle shift, a reorientation of attention before she heard any sound from the small one. Then there was a sound, not the thin, desperate sound of the night before, but something different, a low, querulous noise that was probably, she thought, the Vareth equivalent of waking up hungry and confused in an unfamiliar place. The mother responded with a series of short, close sounds, resonant and rapid, and the small one settled. Dara watched this and thought, of course, the same across everything. The same thing her mother had done and her sister and every mother she had ever seen, the close specific sounds that said, I am here, you are safe, I am here. Some things needed no translation. The mother looked up and met Dara's eyes. Dara raised her coffee mug in a small gesture that she immediately realized was entirely human-specific and probably meaningless, but she did it anyway, and the amber eyes held on her for a moment and something in them shifted and Dara thought, okay, we're both still here. This is good. She went back inside and checked the signal repeaters remotely from the station terminal, because the world kept requiring the things she was there to do regardless of what else was happening. 3 of the 9 repeaters on the Kessler Ridgeline were showing degraded signal output from the storm, which was normal and required manual inspection and adjustment, which she would do once the weather fully cleared, probably tomorrow. She filed a routine maintenance log. She updated her work schedule. She did these small normal things with the door open and the sound of the mother and the small one outside, and found that it felt, strangely, correct, the ordinary and the extraordinary occupying the same space without friction. She stayed a second night. She hadn't planned to. Her schedule called for her to be at the next station in the line by afternoon, but the flooding on the valley road was still impassable, and she was not going to leave with the small one's status still unclear. She updated the maintenance log to note the access issue and did not mention anything else. On the second morning was when it happened. She was at the workbench, going through the diagnostic checks she'd been putting off, when she became aware of movement in the doorway and looked up to find the mother standing, fully standing, not crouched or folded, at the threshold of the shed. At full height, the head was nearly at the roof of the door frame. The amber eyes were at a level significantly above Dara's own, and the scale of it landed differently standing than it had crouched, not frightening, but overwhelming in the way that standing next to something very large and alive always was. The way standing next to an elephant had felt, once, at a sanctuary she'd visited as a child. A presence that reorganized the sense of scale. The mother stood there for a moment. Then, very slowly, she extended one of the wide, flat hands toward Dara. Dara went completely still. The hand moved with a patience and deliberateness that communicated its own kind of communication. This is not fast, this is not sudden, you have time to say no. The fingers up close were extraordinary, each joint articulated with a precision that made human hands look approximate by comparison, and the palm, where it was closest to her, was finer grained than the carapace of the back and shoulders, more like the texture of old leather than of armor. Not soft, but considered. Built for handling things carefully. The hand touched the side of her face. It was not a grab. It was barely a contact, the outer edge of 2 fingers, resting for a moment against her cheekbone, with the same measured gentleness she had tried to use herself the night before. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She could feel the warmth of it. The Vareth ran warmer than she would have expected, or else the cold had numbed her enough that anything felt warm. She held completely still and kept her expression open and tried to be readable, tried to let whatever was there to be seen come to the surface. Then the hand withdrew slowly, back to where it had been. The mother made the sound, the 2-part sound, the opening phrase and the response. Dara sat with it for a long time after the mother had gone back outside. She was not usually a person who felt things arriving at strange angles, not usually given to what she thought of as the more literary modes of experience. She fixed things. She maintained things. She moved from one broken repeater to the next and did what needed doing. She was not, she would have said, the kind of person to whom moments meant something that couldn't be reduced to function and fact. But she sat at the workbench in the shed on the Kessler Ridge relay station on the second morning after the rain, with the diagnostic checks open and unfinished on the screen, and felt something she could not reduce. She thought about her sister's hand on her face in the hospital room, the same quality of touch, careful, measuring, leaving something. She thought the forms of things. She didn't know where the phrase came from. She knew it came from somewhere, something she had read once, and the full shape of it was just out of reach. She sat with the partial phrase and the feeling it carried, which was something like the shapes that things take when they move through the world, the way a gesture can carry more than a gesture, the way a sound can mean more than its parts. The forms of things. She went back to the diagnostic checks. The world still needed its radios fixed. The mother and the small one left that afternoon. She watched them go from the ridge above the station, the mother standing to full height, the small one held close and secured, the amber eyes finding Dara once more at the ridge line and holding there for a moment before they turned and moved into the tree line and were gone. She stood on the ridge for a while after they were out of sight, in the thin clearing light, the mud drying around her boots. She filed the report 6 days later, when the weather broke and the mother and the small one had gone. She dated it accurately. She described what she'd found, what she'd done, what the outcome appeared to be. She left in every technical detail. She left out the part where the mother, on the second morning, had reached out one of those wide, flat hands and very carefully, very slowly, touched the side of Dara's face. The part where Dara had sat completely still and let herself be examined, tried to keep her expression open, tried to be readable. The part where the mother had made a sound that Dara would spend the next 2 years trying to describe to the xenolinguists who eventually asked, and would always fail, because there was no framework for it, no human sound it resembled, only the thing it had made her feel, which was recognized. She kept that part. Some things you keep. The umbrella was found 8 months later. A Meridian work crew doing routine maintenance on the Kessler Ridge line came across it in the mud 3 kilometers from the relay station, and one of the crew photographed it because it had something wrapped around the spokes. Thin, dark filament, organized into patterns that the crew member didn't immediately recognize as anything and photographed anyway out of curiosity. The photograph made its way to the regional maintenance supervisor, who sent it to the central office, who sent it to a contact at the Xenolinguistics Institute at the University of Bergen, because by that time, Dara's report had made its way through 17 layers of interagency bureaucracy and was quietly famous in certain small circles. The xenolinguist who examined the photograph was named Dr. Solène Adami, and she spent 4 days with it before she wrote her preliminary notes. She wrote, "The filament wrapping appears to be of biological origin, consistent with secreted material from several known and some unknown species. The patterns are not random. They are composed of repeating structural units that recur in consistent combinations. Whether these constitute a message, a marker, a memorial, or some category for which we have no word is impossible to determine at this time. What can be said is that this was not done casually. Whatever left this on the umbrella spent time on it. It was deliberate. It was considered. Whatever it means in the original language, in any language, in the deepest structure of any language, it means, I was here, and you were here, and something passed between us that was worth marking." Dara read the notes sitting in her truck in the parking lot of the Meridian Regional Office on a Tuesday afternoon in November, rain on the windshield, coffee going cold in the cup holder. She read them twice. Then she sat for a while without reading anything, watching the rain. She had kept the photograph of the umbrella. She'd printed it and taped it to the wall above her workbench at the relay station, next to the tool checklist and the emergency generator specs. It was not a beautiful object. The umbrella had been broken before she threw it away, and the mud and weather had done the rest. But the filament wrapping on the spokes was intricate even in the photograph, a kind of elaborate care applied to a piece of discarded human junk, and every time she looked at it, she felt the same thing she'd felt when that wide, flat hand touched her face in the gray morning light. Something passing between. She put the truck in gear and drove back out into the rain. Dara Vasquez was not the kind of person who became famous. She became famous anyway. The contact event at Kessler Ridge Station was, as it turned out, the first documented interaction with the Varath, which was the name that human linguists arrived at through 3 years of laborious cross-species signal work, and which the Varath themselves found somewhat inaccurate but were generously tolerant of. They were, it emerged, a species of considerable age and considerable travel, nomadic at a scale that made human interstellar ambition look like a child's first steps. They had been passing through this region of space for generations. They had not announced themselves because they had not, until now, had reason to. The reason they had now had was a small one, currently alive and growing, who had survived because of a relay tube and some antenna wire, and a woman who fixed radios for a living. All of this took years to understand. The xenolinguists worked in careful increments. The diplomatic structures were built slowly and imperfectly. There were misunderstandings, some of them significant. There were people on both sides, though the concept of sides was itself one of the misunderstandings, who argued for caution, for distance, for the maintenance of a careful asymmetry. There were people on the human side who argued that the Varath were too old, too large, too powerful for any of this to end well for humanity. There were people on the Varath side, Dara eventually learned, who had made roughly equivalent arguments in the opposite direction. What moved things forward consistently was not diplomacy. What moved things forward was the photograph of the umbrella. Solène Adami gave a presentation at the First Contact Protocol Conference in Geneva 2 years after Kessler Ridge, in which she showed the photograph and read her notes aloud. The room was full of diplomats, xenolinguists, exobiologists, and a scattering of government officials from 11 nations. Dara was in the back, having been invited as a kind of living exhibit, which she found both slightly ridiculous and oddly moving. Solène showed the photograph and said, "Whatever the Varath intended by wrapping the umbrella, the act itself communicates something that needs no translation. A discarded object, a dying child, something given without expectation, something returned in kind. In kind, that phrase, we treat it as a cliché, a formality, in kind. But look at this. Look at what was spent on this. An object that had been thrown away, not discarded casually, thrown away out of exhaustion, in the rain, after a long day, was found by a being from a civilization older than our writing and wrapped in 2 days' worth of careful work. In kind. That's not a cliché. That's a principle. That's the oldest operating principle of contact between any beings who have ever survived it." The room was quiet. Dara sat in the back and looked at the photograph on the screen and thought about the sound the mother had made. The 4-second sound that changed frequency in the middle. She had tried to describe it to Solène once in a coffee shop in Bergen, and Solène had recorded her description and then played it back and said, "You're describing a 2-part structure. An opening phrase and a response. Like call and response. Like a conversation with yourself. Like an answer to a question that hasn't been asked yet." Dara had thought about that for a long time. In the months between, the world argued. This was not surprising. The world argued about everything, and a first contact event of this kind, quiet, unplanned, undocumented in real time, taking place at a remote relay station by a single off-schedule engineer with no diplomatic training and no recording equipment, gave the argument an unusual amount of fuel. There were people who said it had not been a contact event in any formal sense, that Dara had simply assisted an injured creature, and that projecting interstellar diplomatic significance onto the act was precisely the kind of romantic overreach that led to bad policy. There were people who said the opposite, that the informality was the point, that the best first contacts happened without scripting, that what had occurred at Kessler Ridge was not an absence of protocol, but a demonstration of something deeper than protocol. There were people who said the Varath had been testing humanity and had gotten lucky with their sample. There were people who said that framing was itself evidence of the kind of thinking that got civilizations into trouble. Dara followed this argument from a distance, partly because she was still in the Northern Territories fixing repeaters, and partly because she found, when she tried to engage with it directly, that she lacked the vocabulary for most of the positions being argued. She had not been testing anything. She had not been representing anything, or demonstrating anything, or establishing anything. She had come over a ridge in the rain and found something she couldn't leave alone. She said this in an interview with a journalist from a Bergen science publication, approximately 4 months after the report had begun circulating. The journalist asked her what had been going through her mind when she made the decision to attempt the airway intervention. She sat for a moment and thought about it honestly, which was her habit, and then she said, "I was thinking about the tube diameter and whether the wire loop would hold and whether I was making things better or worse. I wasn't thinking about contact. I wasn't thinking about humanity. I was thinking about the small ones breathing." The journalist wrote this down and looked at it and said, "That's actually the most important thing you could have said." Dara thought about that for a long time, too. She thought the journalist was probably right, and she thought she understood why. But she also thought that it was the kind of thing that was easy to say from the outside and harder to feel from the inside. That the moment of not thinking about contact was the moment of contact. That the absence of the frame was the frame. She had been too cold and too focused to be thinking about the history she was making, which was perhaps exactly the condition under which history could be made without being contaminated by the awareness of itself. Her sister would have said something sharper about this. Her sister had been a nurse and had a particular impatience with the aestheticization of practical acts, the way people wanted the moment of actual help to be beautiful and meaningful from inside itself, when mostly it was just someone's hands doing a difficult thing in inadequate conditions. Dara had inherited enough of this impatience to be suspicious of her own instinct to narrativize what had happened. But she also thought, the tube is still there. The small one is still breathing. Whatever the frame, whatever the meaning, something real had been changed. That was what she knew how to think about, real changes to the physical world. The Varath sent an envoy 18 months after the Geneva Conference. This was fast, by the standards of interstellar diplomacy, and the speed was noted and understood, and it moved people on the human side who had been arguing for caution. The envoy arrived at the orbital station above Bergen, which had been designated the formal contact point largely because Solen's Institute was there, and the receiving delegation included diplomats, linguists, and at the envoy's specific request, Dara Vasquez. She stood in the receiving chamber in a clean jacket that was slightly too formal for her, and watched the airlock cycle, and thought about the first time she'd come over the ridge and seen the shape against the wall and her hand had gone to the flare gun. She thought about the 11 minutes she'd spent filing the tube end smooth. She thought about the way the small one had taken that first tentative exploratory breath. The airlock opened. The envoy was large. All the Varath were large. She had spent 18 months studying what documentation existed. They moved like weather systems, like tidal forces, with a weight that was not aggressive but simply present. The envoy's carapace was a darker slate than the mother's had been, carrying the worn patterns of age and travel. The amber eyes swept the room and located Dara immediately and held there. And then the envoy did something that none of the diplomatic briefing materials had covered. From within the folded mass of its leading limbs, it produced an object. It was a relay coupling tube, 5 millimeters in diameter, smooth-edged, with a small wire retaining loop attached. It had been wrapped as the umbrella had been wrapped in filament work, The same intricate pattern structure that Solène had spent 4 days decoding, but more of it, more elaborate, the kind of work that took not 2 days but many. The room was completely silent. The envoy stepped forward and held the object out to Dara. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at the amber eyes. She thought about the translation briefings she'd attended, about the formal diplomatic protocols she'd been told to follow, about the team of linguists standing behind her ready to assist with any communicative act. She reached out and took it. The weight of it was surprising. Not heavy, lighter than she'd expected, but present in the way that objects are present when care has been put into them, a density that wasn't about mass. She turned it in her hands. The filament wrapping was extraordinary up close. She had studied the photographs of the umbrella for months by now, the macro photography that Solène's team had commissioned, the texture and patterning of the wound fibers, but photographs had not prepared her for the lived quality of it. The way the patterns were not flat but dimensional, built up in layers, so that looking at different angles gave different structural information, the way music changes when you move around a room. She did not know what it meant. She knew it meant something, in the same way that she knew certain repairs she had made over the years had meant something beyond the functional outcome. The care taken exceeded the minimum required, and excess care was always a kind of communication. The room was still completely quiet. She was aware of the people behind her, the diplomats, the linguists, Solène somewhere in the second row, with the quality of peripheral attention she was used to giving machinery. Present, monitoring, not interfering. The envoy made a sound. Low, resonant, sustained, a frequency shift partway through, a two-part sound, an opening phrase and a response. Dara had heard it before. She stood there holding the wrapped tube in both hands, and something came up in her throat that was not quite tears and not quite laughter, and was, she thought, probably the closest she could get to whatever the Varath sound was. Something that answered a question before it was asked. Something that both gave and received simultaneously, in the way that very few kinds of communication managed to do. She thought about the cold and the mud and the thin high sound in the dark. She thought about hands not quite steady. She thought about the 11 minutes of filing and the 4 attempts at placement, and the moment she sat back on her heels and waited, not knowing. She thought about what it meant that this wrapped tube, this wound filament, this object made with enormous care, had been brought here by something from a civilization old enough to have forgotten more than humanity had yet learned, to be given to her. Specifically to her. To the person who had been cold and tired and hadn't been thinking about history. She thought about the forms of things. She said very quietly, "Yeah, I know." The room exhaled behind her. The envoy's amber eyes held on hers for a moment, 4 of them, all at once, which was still something she had to consciously adjust to, the quality of being fully seen from multiple angles simultaneously. And then something in the posture of the enormous being shifted, the same minute relaxation she had seen in the mother on the second morning, something settling that had been held tense. One of the diplomats moved forward, clearing her throat softly, beginning the formal scripted greeting that they had spent 6 months preparing. Dara stepped back and let the diplomacy begin. She held the tube carefully in both hands, its weight both lighter and heavier than it looked, and stood at the edge of the room and watched people do the difficult work of building understanding across an unimaginable gap. And she thought, this will take a long time, and it will not always go well, and there will be misunderstandings that set things back years, and there will be breakthroughs that set things forward decades, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, there will be small moments that nobody writes down correctly, the moments that are actually the substance of the thing. Small moments like this one, like a wrapped tube. Like a sound made once in a shed in the rain and made again, 9 years later in a ceremony hall, carrying the same meaning because meaning, she thought, was not a function of time or distance or the gap between forms of life. It was a function of care taken, and care taken was something that crossed every boundary she knew of, because care taken was just attention and intention and the willingness to stay in the room. She was still in the room. She thought that was probably enough. There was a dinner after the ceremony. Dara attended because she was expected to, and because Solène had promised it would only be 3 hours and had been approximately correct about this. She sat between a Norwegian diplomat named Hakan, who had spent 20 years working on contact terror law, and a xenobiologist from Nairobi named Dr. Kamo Njoro, who had been studying Vareth biology from the available samples for 4 years and was, as far as Dara could tell, operating at a constant state of barely contained professional ecstasy. He talked about the plating structure. He talked about the thermal regulation systems, which were unlike anything in the terrestrial record, and implied an evolutionary history on a world with significant temperature variance at the planetary scale. He talked about the small one's development, which the team had been able to infer from the 2 years of biological material available since the contact shed plating fragments, biological trace from the filament work, and which suggested a growth rate faster than any comparable large terrestrial animal, consistent with a species that needed to reach functional independence quickly. The small one, he said, was roughly equivalent to a 7-year-old in developmental terms. In the 2 years since the contact, Vethalori had grown approximately 40 centimeters and added an estimated 200 kilograms in mass and was, by all indications, doing extremely well. Dara sat with that. She thought about the small, thin sound. She thought about the labor of that chest. She thought about the first tentative breath after the tube seated. A 7-year-old equivalent now, learning things, probably by Vareth standards, asking questions. She hoped there was someone in the vast traveling body of the Vareth fleet who told the story, who said, "This is where you came from. This is the night. This is what a human did in the rain." She hoped there was the equivalent of a bedtime story or a family history or a song passed down, something that kept the specific texture of it alive, not just the outcome but the process. The cold, the 4 attempts, the voice kept quiet and low. She thought maybe the filament piece is that. Maybe that's what the filament piece is. Not a diplomatic gesture and not just a thank you, but the thing that a parent makes to give a child the story of their own beginning. She sat with that thought for the rest of the dinner and said very little, which people had come to expect from her at formal events and which she appreciated being permitted. The diplomatic record of first contact with the Vareth would go on to fill 9 volumes, catalogued at the Bergen Institute and freely available in 37 languages. Scholars would argue for decades about which moment constituted the true beginning, the initial contact at Kessler Ridge, or the envoy exchange at Bergen Station, or the first formal agreement signed 4 years after that, or some earlier point of astronomical intersection that the Vareth marked as the beginning and humans had been unaware of at the time. What the scholars agreed on, because even scholars agree on some things, was that the contact had survived. That was not nothing. Most contact events did not survive the first decade. The record of interstellar diplomacy was not encouraging. There were species who had met and pulled back from each other's strangeness, never finding the thread, never managing the distance between what each side was and what the other side could understand. What Kessler Ridge had given the contact was a thread. Not a language, not a treaty, not a shared understanding of biology or history or cosmology. A thread. The understanding that something had passed between and that it had been worth marking, that the broken thing thrown away in the rain had been found and tended and returned, that the small one had breathed. Dara retired from Meridian Relay Systems at 44. When the travel required for the ongoing contact work made maintaining her equipment routes impractical. She spent the next decade based in Bergen, working with Solène's Institute on the communicative record of the contact, not as a linguist, which she was not, but as what Solin called the material archivist, the keeper of the physical objects that had started everything. The wrapped umbrella, mounted now in a case in the Institute's main lobby, and the wrapped tube which Dara kept. She kept it on the workbench in her apartment, next to a photograph of her sister taken the year before she died, and a small framed print of the Kessler Ridge Station in winter, the 3 signal towers visible against a gray sky, snow on the ground. She thought about the mother sometimes. The scholarship on the Vareth suggested a lifespan measured in centuries, and the contact was now 9 years old, and she had sometimes allowed herself to wonder whether the mother was somewhere in the vast traveling body of the Vareth fleet, carrying the small one, who was, according to the xenobiologists, now a young adult by Vareth standards, and whether it meant anything to them the way it meant something to her. She had asked Solin about this once. Solin had said, "There's a recurring structure in the Vareth formal record that doesn't translate cleanly, but the closest approximation the team has arrived at is something like the one who showed us the form of kindness. It appears in the contact protocols, in the early diplomatic exchanges, in what we think are their historical records from around the time of Kessler Ridge. It refers, as best we can tell, to a specific individual, a specific act, a specific night in the rain." Dora had sat with that. The one who showed us the form of kindness. There was a phrase in the film of human history, a phrase from a playwright, from a speech in a play about dreams and imagination, and the shapes that the mind gives to things that went. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. She had read it once in a literature class she'd taken out of boredom and obligation in her second year of engineering school, and it had stuck, the way odd things stuck, and she thought about it now. The Vareth had given it a name. The form of kindness, not the act of kindness, the form of it, the shape it takes when it moves through the world, a relay tube, a wire loop, a woman on her knees in the mud in the rain, hands not quite steady, talking quietly to a creature she couldn't understand about something she could not know would work. That was the form it had taken that night. She looked at the wrapped tube on her workbench for a long time. Then she went to bed. The Vareth small one's name, as best as the linguists could approximate it in human sound, was something like Vethalori, meaning roughly, the one who returned from the far edge. The mother's formal designation translated, after considerable debate, as Kale Sara, the one who held the thread. Both names were added to the formal diplomatic record and the Bergen Institute's contact archive. Both were taught, in the next generation school curricula, as part of the standard unit on the Vareth contact. What was also taught, in an edition that Dara had argued for, quietly and persistently, over 3 years of curriculum development meetings, was the umbrella. Not the wrapped umbrella, the broken one. The one she'd been carrying for 3 kilometers out of stubbornness before her fingers finally opened, and she let it go. The broken, useless, inverted, shredded thing that she'd dropped in the mud, because she had been exhausted and cold, and the day had already beaten her, and there was no reason to keep carrying something that had stopped serving its purpose. She argued for it because she thought the wrapped umbrella told only half the story. The beautiful half. The half that had been made meaningful after the fact, by someone else's care and attention, and whatever the Vareth equivalent of love was. The other half of the story was the broken one, the thrown-away one. The thing that worked once and then didn't, that she'd hauled through the rain out of a stubbornness she couldn't even justify, and then finally, simply, let go. That was also part of the form of kindness, the part that came before the kindness, the part that was just carrying something broken for as long as you can in the rain, not knowing it was going anywhere, not knowing it was going to matter. Just carrying it. In the 9th year of the Vareth contact, during the formal ceremony marking the signing of the Kessler Accords, the Vareth delegation presented a gift to the human attending party. It was a piece of filament work. Large, the scale of Vareth objects, which was always somewhat overwhelming in human spaces, mounted on a backing of material that the xenobiologists had spent 3 years trying to analyze and concluded was biological in origin and ancient in a way they couldn't fully calculate. The filament patterns had been decoded by that point, approximately. What the piece said, or sang, or showed, or did, in the way that Vareth communicative objects did things rather than simply containing meaning, was not a statement. It was not a declaration or a greeting or a record. It was the sound the mother had made on the second morning. The two-part sound, the opening phrase and the response, an answer to a question before it was asked. The linguists translated it, approximately, as, "We were here and you were here and the small one breathed and this was enough, and it was more than enough, and this is what we carry forward." Dara stood in the ceremony hall in Bergen and looked at the piece and thought about the mud and the rain and the thin high sound in the dark. She thought about the umbrella opening in her hands and inverting in the wind, the canopy folding wrong, and the long moment before she let it go. She thought about her sister's face. She thought about the sound she'd made with her own hands in the cold, filing the edges smooth, testing the airflow, trying to make something small and functional out of whatever was available. She thought, no one is the right person for this. And then she thought, but someone has to do it anyway. And then she stopped thinking and just stood there in the ceremony hall, in the company of people from 2 civilizations who were still learning each other's names, and listened to the sound of the small one's first breath, carried forward in filament and time. Outside it was raining. It was always raining in Bergen, which was one of the things she had come to love about it, the way she had come to love the long approaches to remote stations, and the cold that moved past the point of registration, and the particular flat, tired face she saw in mirrors that only became alert when it mattered. She was, she thought, exactly the right kind of person for this work. Not because she was exceptional. Not because she was brave or brilliant or specially equipped. Because she had spent 9 years learning how to keep moving when the thing she was carrying had stopped working, and how to let it go when she needed her hands free, and how to use what was in the locker even when it wasn't what she would have ordered, and how to kneel in the mud and talk quietly about nothing in particular and mean, with every word, "I am here. I am staying. Let me try." She looked at the filament piece on the wall and thought about the mother's amber eyes. Bright now in memory, bright. The rain came down on Bergen, and the Vareth envoy stood across the room, and the small one, Vethalori, the one who returned from the far edge, was alive somewhere out in the enormous dark, and the relay tube with its wire loop and its careful wrapping was on her workbench at home next to her sister's photograph, and the umbrella was in the institute lobby in its glass case, tended and named. Everything broken that had been carried far enough had arrived somewhere. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she knew. Dara Vasquez stood in the ceremony hall in Bergen, and the lights were warm and the Vareth were here and the small one was alive, and she thought, this was enough. It was more than enough. This is what we carry forward.